Thank you for staying with us. Well, just 2 days after the inaugural speech of the president, of course, it was put out by the NNPC Limited that they informed us, esteemed customers, that they have adjusted the pump price of PMS across all retail outlets in line with the current market realities. That was following the president's statement. And of course, that didn't go without an immediate reaction, in the market. Of course, everyone has been reacting to that, and that has led to conversations upon conversations with the president, the government being engaged by CSOs and the labor movement entirely. The labor movement on their own, on that issue of subsidy removal, demand the reversal of the recent petrol price hike and criticize the insensitivity and dictatorship of the Tinubu government. They argue that the majority of Nigerians in the formal sector will suffer from the price increase, and consequently they call for a consultative commission to address the subsidy removal issue. If the government does not respond, they plan to take peaceful action on the streets. Well, that is part of the conversation that is ongoing. However, there are many that are not even reacting in that way. Their pockets are reacting. Let's have a conversation around this morning with Ayodele Oni, who is a policy expert on energy. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Mr. Oni. Well, you have been part of conversations with governments on this matter for quite a while, dating as far back as, the time that, government was transiting into this privatization and all of that. This current move that is ongoing now, definitely a good number of people are feeling the pinch quite significantly. Yes, everyone is telling the people to make adjustments, but there is nothing to adjust when you don't have space in the clothes that's remaining on you. The next thing will probably be what? What would be your immediate reaction or immediate comments on what is currently ongoing now concerning this fuel subsidy, especially from the angle of the people?
Okay, from the angle of the people, thank you very much for that question. From the angle of the people, it's understandable that people will complain, but the truth also is that whether or not we remove subsidy, we are already very challenged. Government can no longer afford it, whereas the people also, the consumer price index will go up. That's inflation. You understand? People will complain about it. It will affect people's purchasing power. What I expect the government to do, because the step the government took was the right step at that point, but I expect government to develop a robust data system and to ensure that there's a robust social safety structure in place so that the less privileged, the challenged, can have good alternative. I've always said that for government to remove subsidy, it's a chicken and egg. Some people would argue that government should do three things first, and that's an argument I've always pushed. Ensure that we refine substantially all of what we need, maybe even have much more to export. Two, have electric power almost 100% of the time, and have alternative means of transport. If you have all of those three, it substantially reduces the quantity of PMS you and I use every day. We don't need to power our generators anymore. We probably drive shorter distances because I just drive to the ride and park or to the train station.
Permit me to butt in. What you're saying now isn't something we're hearing for the first time. It's something that's been said over and over again, provide the palliatives. But then you also said, in your opening comments, that government doesn't even have the money for the subsidy. So where will government get the money to provide these palliatives that you're talking about?
Okay, so good point. Recall that you could always borrow funds. The question then is, what are you borrowing the funds for? Because if you borrow funds for non-productive activities, you are then causing more problems, and your lenders may even have a challenge giving you. But if you borrow funds for infrastructure, remember when you speak about those social safety nets, you also have to look at excellent infrastructure, rails that would also generate income. I'm currently in the UK on my way back to Lagos, but throughout my stay, I've gone on the underground mostly. You know, and it sounds so expensive, but I was reading some information about billions of dollars the London transport makes annually. So it's both ways. It reduces our cost as Nigerians, also generates income for the government, and government can borrow to develop some of this infrastructure. But if you are borrowing to pay subsidy, remember I said government could no longer afford, the government didn't have that money, but government can borrow for infrastructure, which would work for both the citizenry and also government income. That's the way I see it. And that infrastructure would be able to pay back the loans. So I think it's the chicken and egg. Some would say all of these three things cannot be done before we remove subsidy because we then won't be able to afford it because no one's going to lend us money. Some would say that we insist, and that's what the Labour is saying, we insist some of these things are in place and much more before subsidy. So the truth is someone needs to bite the bullet. You understand? Head or tail, it's a challenge for the citizenry. So at some point, someone needs to take that stand and then aggressively and very quickly do things to ameliorate the pains that the citizenry will suffer.
Allow me to take a snippet from the previous conversation. Bukola emphasized it when asking our guest the other time about the analogy of the husband with 36 wives. Now, in this case, the husband isn't directly affected. It is the 36 wives, in this case, the governors, the states, the people who live in various states that are directly affected. And of course, yes, the federal government is having conversations with Labour and some other interest groups at that. Is there a role? We'll come to those issues. I'm pretty sure Bukola has questions along that line. But is there a role for governors in this wise? Is there something that the governors and the state, at the state level, the houses of assembly at the states level, can do to intervene, palliate, ameliorate the pains, the bite of this current situation on the people while the federal government and Labour are still in talks?
Oh, yes, most definitely. During one of my studies, I lived in North America, and I did see what provinces, which are equivalent of states, did. Apart from whatever, and that's the advantage of a federal system of government. You have, beyond what the federal government does, you have what states can do. But the challenge is whether states have sufficient data, have sufficient information on individuals, you know. States, I've seen in a particular year, the state of Alberta or the province of Alberta provided funds for every family that earned below a particular amount. You understand? You could do that similar to that direct payment the former administration was doing. But was it well done? Was it data driven? That's one thing that can be done. Then very quickly, there are other means of transportation. Like there are states that have good water. There are states that you can consider other means very quickly. And it's also providing safety, providing some form of guarantees, you know, and encouraging private sector to quickly jump onto that. And I know a number of states are already working around power. See, these are some of the things you can do. I have a challenge generally and personally giving money to people, but at a particular level, that can be done, but it needs to be done properly. It needs to be well structured, and you need to ensure that you have sufficient data with respect to those people you give it to. And then in terms of some of the income, people have always paid taxes. At times, you give people back some of the taxes that have been paid directly. So I think states do have. That's why we operate a federal system of government.
In the situation where the states themselves don't have the money, what happens? There are quite a number of things have been said about some states not being viable themselves. So what happens in that situation?
Okay, so it goes to the foundation of our federal system. I, as a person, think we have too many states. One, two. I also think that in every federal system, go to those countries many people want to run to, the Australias, the Canadas of this world, you'd find out that not every state is really viable. The federal government does support. That's where the federal government comes in. If Lagos, if Ogun, if Oyo, if River State Delta can do that. Those states that cannot, that's where the federal government comes in. And naturally so. So he's got 36 wives. I'm sure some of those 36 wives have great jobs. Some of them work in telecom, some of them work in oil companies, some of them are very good businessmen, particularly if they are from Lagos, say Ikorodu, for example. You know, so some of those 36 wives will have what it takes. Some of them will not. That's where the husband comes in my own view. You just need to drive all of this with data, and we need an integrated approach to energy, to social safety net, and all of that. We need an integrated planning in the country.
Yeah, Mr. Oni, so many interesting allusions, coming out from the program today. And when Ayo talked about palliatives, my mind just went back to the pandemic era, and the images that flashed were the abundance of palliatives in the north and the kidnapped palliatives in the south. Well, you don't have to answer that. Let's look at, the representation of labor in all of this process, Mr. Oni, particularly, the approach that it has adopted with the new administration. One of the key components in its Charter of Demands was that, okay, return the pump price of fuel to the status quo while we continue with the negotiations. And, that has not seen the light of day. And we're approaching the end of June, where subsidy is not covered any longer. That on the one hand. On the other hand, look at how Labour has been restrained by that court order obtained by the administration, restraining it from embarking on strike. Don't you think that Labour has gotten the short end of the stick, and as a result, Nigerians are the ones suffering, groaning beneath the weight of the new pump price of petrol? Is there a better approach that Labour and its affiliates can adopt to get better representation for the people amid all of this?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's pretty straightforward. In my view, first, the train has left the station. If you don't have the money, then you don't have the money. If no one's going to lend you money, even for certain projects, because of energy transition and all of that, it's even more difficult to get projects, get funding. Speak much less of getting funding for subsidies. That's one. That's borrowing money now for subsidies by the federal government. Now, I think the part of the challenge Labour does face is not having sufficient information at times. There's a lot going on social media, and people just jump on those things. I've heard stories around DSDP and government not paying subsidies and all of that. Some people have some of the information, but not sufficiently, but then they don't then project that. So I think that Labour needs more information, needs more technical people to sit with them and explain the situation properly. If the situation is explained properly, then we can have a system where we give government time and milestones. We expect by October, we start producing sufficient quantity, rather refining sufficient quantity of crude. That already reduces our cost by 20-27% because we'll no longer import. Then you say another 1 year, the power sector should improve in certain states up to a particular percentage. All of that, I think the Labour should work with government in terms of those milestones and social safety nets. What ideas do you have? And I also think that even the private sector should be involved. It's about policy. Government can have a system where private sector companies pay only 50% taxes and have to employ X number of people or have to carry out certain projects, similar to what the last administration did with roads. You can extend this to certain areas. You can say for 5 years, and it would be planning. Labour should work with government, not against government. Agree milestones, agree period within which those milestones should be met. It will be painful for everyone. At some point, this had to be done. That's the truth. The question is, at what point? Do you want to do those three things I always mention first, or want to remove subsidy first? And I think I think the president did what he did on that day, because if he hadn't done it then, he would never have done it. 2 years down the line, he'll be thinking about the next election and would never be able to do it. So he had to do it now, bite the bullet, see what we can do to move the country forward. So I think Labour should get people who have sufficient knowledge and not just people who are emotional, sit with them, understand how these things work, and then work with government with timelines and what should be achieved in those timelines. That's what I think.
Dr. Oni, in fairness to Labour, you know, there are different segments of Labour, and in fairness to them, they have been working with government. As a matter of fact, they now have an 8-week window in which they have agreed to come up with, you know, a slew of measures to ease the pains and the difficulties that workers and, you know, generality of Nigerians will be experiencing as a result of these changes. And for a number of people, I mean, you have also listed some of your own expectations in terms of government coming up with plans, because really what people really want to see is a plan. I mean, they don't want to suffer endlessly. They want to know when their suffering will end and how their suffering will end, you know, just how we intend to see light at the end of the tunnel of this. But in the meantime, you know, for people who have also perceived that, you know, the public officers, when they get into office, serve themselves more than they serve the people. Don't you think that there ought to be some measures that government is also taking to show that it is serious about the cost of cutting, cutting the cost of governance, to ensure that, you know, it is not only the people whom they're asking to make sacrifices. That sacrifice is also sitting in government quarters as well.
Good point. I think you've said something very critical. We need to hold government accountable, and the government then needs to do what it ought to do. You know, if we should be the government should fear the people, and I expect that the president will do what's right, cut down the cost of governance, cut down the number of people in government. I think number of personnel, you know, I think that's important. It wouldn't be fair to say that only the populace, only the common man should go through this. I think everyone should. So you made a valid point, and with the Labour, I think that's also valid, and that's a right step in terms of what they seek to achieve. So you're right. I agree completely that government does need to do that, and we need to then be able to hold government as citizens. We have the office of the citizens, and we need to then hold government accountable. And I expect that the president will do what is right. I believe he's a listening president, and he'll do what's right in that respect.
Do you have anything specific? I mean, do you have any specific ideas on the areas that they should look at to cut the cost of governance?
Okay, personnel is one thing, because when you speak to personnel, you speak about daily payments, you speak about salaries, you speak about their own special advisors. Cut down the number of people. For example, and I think I've seen some progress, a little progress. You have a number of special advisors. Rather than having a special advisor for power and oil and gas, you have one for energy that cuts across both. And you see that in a number of those appointments. So I expect that even for ministries too, there'll be ministries that will be merged, you know. And because remember, once you have one minister instead of two, then you have half that number of special advisors too. So I think it goes to personnel. If you think about maybe a salary cut too, wouldn't be a bad idea. And you know, we need to also be careful when this is done, because it then could even impact the average civil servant. So we need to be careful about this narrative, how we go about this. But for me, I think the key thing is reduction of personnel, not even so much about salaries, it's more personnel, because there are too many people doing the same thing, in my own view. Even ministries, departments and agencies of the federal government too, I think something needs to be done about those. Speaking
about personnel, let me take you to the private sector, because you made reference to that in passing. Now, they are also very hardly hit. I mean, seriously hit, I should say, on this matter, because now workers will be demanding they raise their allowances. I know that in one of those Labour TUC's demands, they talked about tax holiday at some point to ensure that people can cope, or organizations too can have something to piggyback on. And I do remember that the president also spoke about, there you go, they want tax holiday for employers, both in government and private sector particularly. But they also say that those who earn, 200,000 or 500,000 naira monthly, it goes on. Now, what would you recommend? How would you suggest government approach this? Because the private sector, they hold a very key position in the scheme of things. What would you advise?
Okay, my view is that government should cut taxes or reduce taxes, but expand the net. More people pay taxes, but pay less. I think the private sector should be encouraged to do more. It's a holistic thing. You need to look at taxation. You need to look at the cost of doing business. I always say to people, when I speak to my friends who are non-Nigerians and who complain about tax, I say Nigerians pay the most taxes in the world. Why? Both formal and informal taxes. I know people who run businesses, and I'm an investor in a business, a trucking business. That business has over 200 permits. It's trucking. Every state, every local government you go to, you know. So government needs to work from a practical standpoint on reducing the cost of business. That's the first thing. And then taxation. But in return, using data, and this is very important, data is very important in a lot of what we're saying. Using data and ensuring that when you reduce taxes and give certain incentives, companies have a number of people they have to employ. So if you improve the ease of doing business, not theoretically, but in practice, in reality. And I'll give you an example. There's the ease of doing, there's the Business Facilitation Act, which speaks to time within which certain approvals must be had. And if you don't get the approval, it's deemed that you already have it. But in practice, you can't go to the bank and say, oh, I have a deemed approval. In practice, does the ministry or department or agency of the federal government give you a document? So we need practical implementation of our laws. That's one, to improve ease of business, reduce taxes, and then benchmark it against the number of people. Maybe take the top 20 taxpayers in the country and have a number of people they must employ over a period of time. That's the way I think it could be done. I'm sure there are other ways people can think of, but for now, those are the things I think government needs to do. Ease of doing business, reduce taxes to encourage more people to employ more people, and energy, ensure that the power sector is much improved, because I understand that the private sector spends upwards of 40% on just power. That's unbelievable.
Mr. Oni, just following up on the conversation with Malkwe about the demand on the people to make sacrifices and what the elected elite are also bringing to the table in that regard. Labour also has a committee on cost of governance. I wonder if Labour can go very far with their own demands on the elected representatives, to make sacrifices as well on cost of governance. Are you optimistic in that regard?
Yeah, well, I am optimistic, because I believe that the current administration wouldn't want to make the same mistakes as the previous administration. I also believe that we've got a number of people who listen. I believe the president has a listening ear, and I think he will listen and do his utmost to ensure that the country does move forward. You hear him say that he danced, he begged for this job. So he just has to perform. Whereas employers, and he just needs to perform so that we can renew his contract of employment. So I think he will listen. And I know a few of his close cabinet, and I think some of them are people who want real progress for the country and who do their very best to ensure that we move forward. And I think removing subsidy is one of those things. It's just ensuring that we ameliorate the effect.
Well, there are too many questions to ask you on this matter, because the issue is unending and the bite isn't any less effective. But for now, we have to thank you so much for your time. Dr. Ayodele Oni is a policy expert, especially in the area of energy. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, your own contribution to the program this morning is next, and Professor Enakena's comments comes first. Nigeria Police, that's what he's interested in, needs recruitment in form of personnel, reinforcement in terms of adequate ammunition and other equipment like vehicles, and reformation, which is removing police from the exclusive list to concurrent, to allow for the establishment of state police for effective policing of rural and suburban areas where terrorism, banditry, kidnappings, and armed robbery are prevalent.
Well, Law Alpha Cross's comment is pretty short and concise. He says, the security of lives of Nigerians should be paramount. Even as new service chiefs have been appointed, lives of Nigerians have been traumatized and many feared dead. Well, the question is, how do they go about it this time around? What will change?
Well, Festus Akinboyewa is talking about the National Assembly, and he says now that the 10th NAS has been inaugurated and has started sitting, the legislative agenda must capture the challenges facing our country. They must focus energies on key bills that will address insecurity, unemployment, more oil sector reform, poverty, gender inequality, and general bread and butter issues in our country.
Well, King says sharing palliatives through cash isn't realistic. FG should use the fund meant for palliatives to set up modular refineries for each state, give them crude at discounted amount, and ensure they have mega fuel stations in all local governments. Don't choke the people any further, he says. All right. Well, there you go. That is the show today. We do thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time. I'm Chamberlain, so goodbye.
Thank you. I'm Maokwe Ogun-Yusuf. Have a beautiful day.
Indeed. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for watching. I am Bukola Koka.
I'm Ayo Makinde. Bye for now.